Welcome back to the Scholar Wealth Podcast. This week, we're bringing you a special episode, a little different than our usual format. Last week, about 60 of us gathered in Asheville, North Carolina at the Grove Park Inn for our annual Personal Wealth Conference. If you've never been, it's stunning. Historic property, incredible views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the perfect setting for what we do at our conference every single year. The conference is an intentionally small, private, curated gathering of investors, business owners, and successful families. 2 full days of focused conversations on the market, strategy, and long-term wealth planning. No sponsors, no sales pitches, no expo halls, just substantial sessions and real conversations among people who are actually working through this stuff. We kicked things off Wednesday evening with a welcome reception, then ran full days of sessions on Thursday and Friday. The speaker lineup this year is absolutely amazing, covering everything from market valuations and private business investing to estate planning and building multi-generational portfolio. And between sessions, people were off at the pickleball courts, hiking, having dinner together. That's a big part of what makes it worth the trip every single year. We also have a tradition of closing out the final day with the announcement of the following year's conference location, and we're excited to share that we'll be gathering in Miami in 2027. More details to come, but if you want early bird access once registration opens, go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. One of the things we did this year was record a live Q&A panel. Questions came in on the spot, handwritten slips of paper hitting the table. We had Deon, Derek, and myself fielding whatever came through. Topics ran the full range: home purchase, trusts, inherited money, real estate syndications, ISOs, hedge funds, talking to your kids about money, the kind of questions that come up when you're in a room full of people who are genuinely working through this stuff. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right. So I guess we're going to drag questions from here until Aaron tells us to stop is the plan. So we'll see how if we grab some. This one's handwritten. So this one's good. Let's get for. All right. Regarding a new home purchase, could you speak to the pros and cons of purchasing a new home outright rather than taking on a mortgage, assuming you can afford withdrawing money that will have little to no impact on your retirement or your lifestyle? Controversial topic to start us off. This is going to cause some issues fast. But let's go. Deon, kick us off with this one. Are you taking out cash to purchase the home if you can afford the cash? Or you didn't take out the mortgage for the flexibility?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, we can make up.
Can we make up any numbers what we want? Is the mortgage less than $750,000?
No.
I look at this as a cost of funds. And so if right now, probably I would buy it outright because mortgages are running above 6%. And so given what we're projecting for market returns, even on an after-tax basis, it would be cheaper I think I would earn more basically not having the mortgage than having the mortgage. But if you could borrow, say, for whatever reason, we were in a different interest rate environment, and you could borrow at that mythical 3% number, and I could deduct the interest, which would drive my after-tax cost down into the low 2 range, and my use of funds would put me at 6%. I would take the 6% and pay the 2.25 or 2.5.
I think that sounds good. Derek for the rebuttal. Is there a number? Let's put it this way. Is there a percentage? Well, I guess I'm assuming that you would agree with that, but maybe you completely disagree. But is there a percentage interest rate that would change? Like at what point does the interest rate get so low where you say take the mortgage?
I think when it starts getting below like 6%, it starts to make more sense because then, like as Deon pointed out, you get the tax deduction, which is going to bring down that effective rate closer to what maybe below what you would earn in a savings account if you were just going to go that route, or if you were actually investing it in the market. Is that what did I answer that right?
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right to me. Around that, you start dropping below 6%, I think it makes it really. You get down to that 4% effective after-tax rate, which even on a diversified portfolio starts to look attractive, right? Of where we would want to pull that out there.
I have one more.
Of course.
Oh, of course I did. The other thing is this is like a mental accounting issue. If the mortgage acts as a disciplining mechanism that you might not otherwise have, right? So if you pay for it just out of your brokerage account and then you lack a mortgage, sometimes a mortgage, I think, acts as this anchoring mechanism for some people when it comes to their budgeting. That's why, like, when we ask clients frequently we ask them, how great is your budgeting skill? You have the client who says a 10, then I would say that's not a thing. But if you had asked me this, I would give myself a 1. And for me, it probably would be a bad idea.
I couldn't agree more with your assessment of your budgeting skills. All right, let's jump into another one. All right, my in-laws want to give each of their kids and grandkids the annual gift tax exclusion amount every year. There are like 14 people in the family. Is that actually a good strategy? Is there something better at their level? Ooh, all right. Kids and grandkids, annual exclusion. Good strategy, something better. I think it depends on whether or not the amount that they could give exceeds that, right? So if this is going to help significantly reduce their estate and they can afford it in there, I don't see any issue with that being the limit. Depending on how old the 14 people are in the family, you start going out further, you're running some risks there, but add to that.
Yeah, I think when I look at that and I see about giving money to children, you can do that, and it's going to probably go to a custodial account. The issue becomes, in most states, that age of majority is going to be 18 years old. So once they hit 18, that money becomes theirs. So if you're doing $19,000 a year for a number of years, that could be a pretty substantial amount that a young kid who's probably somewhat irresponsible can suddenly have all this access to. So you might want to think about it. Maybe you set up a trust or something like that rather than just putting it in this custodial account.
Can always pull the "don't tell them the account exists" line, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. Anything to add to? Yeah. All right. Next one up. Another kids one. Our kids are 16 and 19. If something happened to us tomorrow, I don't want my 19-year-old getting a lump sum of money. This is a great segue. This isn't what is a good way to structure things so they get it gradually. And I think that's exactly what you were saying. At that point, you'd want some sort of trust established, right? But I'll add to this question. If you have this concern, where's the line drawn of where you consider that to be too much money?
Oh my.
When does that become a problem? When's it worth getting the trust?
I think it depends on the kid, right? We all, I have a daughter who I wouldn't have worried about. I have a son who maybe I would have worried about a little bit, right?
His budgeting skills are 1 of 10?
Budgeting skill. Well, it turns out he's done a pretty good job. I will say, just to go what Derek said, and I can use my own case. I set it up so my youngest would have to reach a certain age, right? Which is a pretty classic, I think, strategy. So I think mine youngest had to get to 26 or 27, and that's when the trust dissolved, right? So I think, you have to make an assumption at some point that they're going to reach a level of maturity that you have to trust, right? So you hope you've done the job. It's kind of like when my daughter started dating. I wanted to erase every male from existence. And my wife told me that I eventually had to simply trust that I had been the parent that I needed to be. I still didn't trust him, just as a point of record.
All right. Anything to add on structure there of how you...
Yeah, the only thing I would add is you mentioned dissolving at 26, 27. You could also build it into the trust that they can use the money for certain purposes, like buying a new home, college, stuff like that. That's probably the only thing I'd add to that.
All right. My brother and I are both beneficiaries of a trust our parents set up. He wants to distribute everything, close it out, and be done with it. I think we should leave it alone. Do we have options if we can't agree on the distribution strategy? Unfortunately, yeah, that's going to be ugly, right? On that. So you want to distribute everything, close it out, right? And be completely done. there's some tax issues with doing that, right? I think we should leave it alone. What options? My initial thought, and then I'll hand it over as you are thinking about some of the things. I think it's going to depend on what type of assets are in that trust, because if they are more illiquid assets or things that are going to have major tax implications of trying to remove them from the trust, then that could be a pretty big deterrent to just closing it out, being done with it. But depending on how that trust is set up, you might not have that choice, right? Of how that's going to be distributed. And I mean, based on our conversations this morning and things, if it was set up correctly, they shouldn't have a choice at all in whether or not they can take that money out at that point. But what do you think? Your initial thoughts on it?
I guess it would depend a little bit on how the trust is structured, but if the trust is set up where you could actually just distribute the actual assets, you don't necessarily have to sell anything. So you could just distribute out the assets to each person, close it. But obviously it depends on how the trust is set up, and you honestly want to check with like a CPA, make sure it's not going to create some other situation. But
and that the assets are divisible.
Yeah. If it's a house, you got a problem. But if it's like a bunch of shares, then you can just split it evenly.
Yeah, I feel like we need to phone a friend to bring Aaron back up. Right?
That's a great idea.
All right. Oh, this is good. All right. We invested in a few real estate syndications a couple of years ago, and they've basically done nothing. The operators are still sending quarterly updates, but the returns aren't what we were told. What questions should we be asking? This is I feel like this one comes up regularly, unfortunately. And from a historical context, what ended up happening is when interest rates are really low, and real estate prices started getting really high in the past, 2019-20, like the COVID era, you started to see a lot of these being pitched everywhere, of these real estate syndications, to the point that we were looking at some points where the PowerPoints, the pitch decks were just full of typos. Like it was a disaster. Like everything was misspelled. The people who were on the management team had never owned any real estate or done anything with real estate whatsoever. And they were getting pretty ugly there, which is always a great sign of things not being a good area to be investing in whenever you have all of that. But unfortunately, this is starting to become more common, because when you get into these different types of private investments, whenever somebody throws out a projection of what they think is going to happen, there's always these really nice charts up and to the right of what's going to happen. And a lot of the assumptions at that time were that they were going to refinance after building up buy an apartment complex for $10 million, and then on a loan of 3 or 4%, or at that time maybe like 5 or 6%. And the hope was, well, we're going to paint the walls, change out the floors, we're going to double rents, and then it's going to be worth $20 million, and then we'll do a refinance at 3%, and our return is going to go through the roof. And they would show these projections, and then the interest rates went up, and all those assumptions went away real quick on where the projections were. So what questions would you be asking, Deon, when you're getting these quarterly statements from your investment?
Well, we can't go back in time, I'm presuming, and I
go back in time.
I can't counsel my client. No. For God's sakes, no.
You're getting the quarterly updates.
I'm getting the quarterly updates now. This is one of those cases where an illiquid asset, right? This is a problem, right? I mean, you have to accept in some sense here, sometimes you have to wait it out a little bit, right? And because if you can't find an easy buyer here, you're hoping that you got the advice at the time that this represented 5% of your portfolio, right? So that's the whole benefit of holding. One of the things of limiting unusual assets like real estate, gold, other commodities, anything like that, to 5 or 10% of your portfolio, that you have the wherewithal at that point to not, it's not going to tank your overall position, right? So I think this is one of those cases where you hope you did the right thing initially. I know I can't go back in time and convince them not to. I think this is also an example where the problem with this kind of real estate, right? If the asset could freely adjust to changes in rates, it would be okay. But we find, right, with real estate that does not adjust as cleanly to interest rate shocks as other assets, right? So it's much more like say a bond than it is like an equity.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's why you have to really, really, really pay attention and say what part of our portfolio needs to be relatively liquid and what part can we afford to be illiquid.
Questions? Other ones you'd be asking?
Yeah, I don't think, honestly, asking questions is going to do you much good. You're stuck in it. The only thing I'd probably be asking is what's the plan as far as liquidation? What's the goal to ultimately sell this property so then you can get back some of your money, hopefully.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what I would be asking. My concern at this point would be how bad were their projections, and really looking into them to find out whether or not their projections now actually make sense. Because what's going to end up happening is if their projections still are bad, then you run the risk of a capital call. So it's a reverse liquidity issue. It's even a worse illiquidity issue. Not only can you not sell, but they come back to you and say, hey, you're one of the owners. We're now in the hole this year, so we need you to put up an extra $50,000 to maintain your ownership in the property, or else you're going to get diluted. So there's another risk that this happens, that you continue to go down that road of it and continuing. So that's definitely the case, but that's not uncommon with real estate and private investments. If there's not, the original plan is always an exit within 7 years. If you ever look at any type of private investments or anything, 5 to 7 years is the typical timeline that they're shooting for. So once they get to 5 to 7 years and they haven't sold yet, if there's a reason they haven't sold, then they're just going to hang on to it, and it's cash flowing. So they're just going to have this slow trickle of cash flow that continues to come in, and then they charge the fees on the trickle, right? On all of that. So that's not uncommon, but to Deon's point, that's at this point, that would be the move. I think the questions I'd be asking are just making sure that there's no additional capital that's going to be needed in the future. And even then, that doesn't really change anything. If it hasn't done this well, that doesn't mean you should go contribute more to it, right? But at least you would know what the situations look like. Ooh, this has Derek written all over it.
Super.
I exercised a bunch of ISOs back in 2021 when my company was doing well and the stock dropped 80%. I've heard I may have generated an AMT credit. What is that, and can I actually use it? Good. This is a regular one that comes in on that mismatch of the AMT credit.
We defer to the CPA on this one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, why don't you take this or go through AMT, the idea?
Yeah, so when you exercise those ISOs back in whatever year that was, that spread between the exercise price and whatever the value was is not subject to ordinary income tax, but it can be subject to AMT, alternative minimum tax, which is a parallel tax system that the government set up to make sure that they're getting theirs. So you basically pay the higher of each. So when you exercise, you may have created AMT tax, and if you paid AMT tax, you can get a credit later on. So if you were to sell those shares, you'll have an AMT basis in those shares. So when you sell those, you would be able to get some of that credit for whatever the basis is back that way. The other way you can get that credit back is in years that your regular income tax exceeds AMT, you can recoup it in those years as well. It kind of depends. I think the issue becomes around AMT tax. Say, you exercise this year, you have a bunch of income, you pay AMT, but then you retire a year later. Now have low income. It's unlikely that you're going to be generating a lot of space to get that credit back from year to year. But if you do sell the shares, you can recoup some of that. So
Retirement risk.
Yeah. So, as long as you still have the shares and you sell them, you can get some of that back.
Thing you'd like to add? I'm 41. My husband is 44. We have 2 kids and a combined net worth of about $8 million. At what point does it make sense to start talking to our kids about money? Our parents never talked to us about it and don't think that served us well. Good way to put it. I don't think it's early enough. I just think I don't think there's too early of a time to think about talking to kids about money. I just think it changes over time, the type of conversation you have with, kids who are 40 is very different than the type of conversation you have when your kid's 4 about maybe you're not bringing up trusts at 4 years old, but you're starting to talk about other things around money and what a penny is compared to a quarter, right? Or what used to be a penny, I should say, back in the day when they had pennies. So, and I know you've got your panel on this tomorrow, so you'll have to hold back all the secrets. But
I don't have any secrets, but I will say this almost relates a little bit to the question I got a while back. It was about a wedding. Do you remember this? I had like a question for a thing with a wedding, and I would say
remind the audience, because
so
those who don't know that.
right. So it was that basically the question was, how much should you spend on a wedding when the amount you spend on the wedding is unrelated to your planned success? Whatever you spend on the wedding, it wouldn't affect your retirement, right? That was basically the question. And I responded, I think Aaron brought that question to me, and I responded, and I think they brought it to me because I had just paid for a wedding, so I was still traumatized. Anyway, and I think what I said was something along the lines, and I think that applies here.
I think it was go big.
No,
big
no,
or go
no,
home.
no, it was,
That's it.
no, that's what I paid. That's not what I recommend. What I said was, and I think this applies to money in general, which maybe we'll talk about some tomorrow, and it comes down to values, right? And so the early thing, what you're trying to give your kids is the values you want to instill in them, and the money simply gets reflected in their values, right? And so you can have that conversation with your kids later on, but the first thing you want to do, in my opinion at least, is instill in them, intellectual curiosity, caring about people, all those things which we did around my dinner table was a really interesting dinner table to be around because it was a really active. Like we would challenge, I would ask questions deliberately. I shouldn't say this, to provoke responses, right? That was the kind of dinner table I had. And part of that was about generating values, right? So they could understand how their mom and I talked about things, what we understood was important, because the money will reflect what you think is important. And I think that's the sort of notion there that I tried to give to my kids, not whether they should do a Roth conversion. I'll do that with them later.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme that we always see is that money amplifies behavior, right? And it amplifies values as well, right? So whatever has been instilled is what we continue to see generation after generation in conversations, that it doesn't have to be the direct money conversation as much as it is the values. The money's just going to amplify that in unfortunately both directions if the values aren't in the right place. But what about you, Derek? What are your thoughts? When does it make sense to start those conversations? How does that change, or any additions?
I think Deon did a far better job of answering than I can on that one. Yeah, I think it's probably never, I guess it'd be too early. Like you said, they have to be old enough to comprehend. But yeah, like Deon said, just instilling small values here. I know my kids, they get money in their pocket. They want to go buy a video game, but, something. I do my best to try to convince them not to. And, hey, save it for later. You might need a car when you're older. Never works. But I think having those conversations and maybe trying to get them to think about the bigger picture. And any time they do get some money, I think that can be helpful. We'll see if it works. So far, it's been a loser, but...
I think the thing I'd add to this one is that I don't think it's anything that's kid specific, right? I think it is specific to each individual child, right? That we see that as, and I think that definitely starts at a young age. I've got one who'll count every penny that goes to the bank account, right? And we'll spend all day looking for a lost nickel because it's not adding up, right? And the other one's out, handing out cash like it's, his job. So it's different types of skills that need to be generated there. Time for another? Do we have? All right, perfect. All right, this is a good one too. All right, a friend of mine has been in a hedge fund for years and swears by it. I have a meeting with them next week. What should I be asking him to evaluate whether it's worth it? So I think this goes a little bit, not to plug my lecture for earlier, since I know everyone was wide awake for that one. But the first thing is determine whether or not it makes sense, right? The assumption that your friend's finances are just like your finances, the capacity for risk is the same, is a strong assumption out there. So making sure that that actually matches is how I would think would be the first step, and then trying to determine whether or not the evaluation of that fund or of that investment actually makes sense. But what do you think, Deon? You're walking into the hedge fund meeting next week. What kind of questions are you asking about their strategy?
I think you said the right word, strategy. If I'm not sure, for example, if it was a long only hedge fund, you're going to have a really hard time convincing me that a long only hedge fund makes sense. Whereas if it was say a long, not even a long short, but let's say I have a friend who manages a hedge fund and he specializes in emerging markets, right? And that one kind of makes a little more sense to me because it's really hard for me to take positions in emerging markets in some places, right? I could buy an emerging markets ETF, but that's not quite the same kind of things he takes investments in. So for me, I would ask those kind of questions. What kind of firms are you investing in? Are they names I know? Because I would be more likely to invest if it was names I didn't necessarily know. And then, of course, you want to look at the long run. What do their fee structure look like? Do they have an underwater clause? Right. So if they go underwater, do their fees go away? Because as we all know, investors respond to incentives or managers respond to incentives. So I think the first thing they would have to understand is have a really detailed knowledge of their positions, what kind of positions they're planning on taking, and what kind of fee structure, and is it incentive compatible? Does it make sense if they don't win, right? Because if I'm taking a position in a hedge fund in emerging markets, that's a super, super illiquid, risky fund, and I would want to know all those kinds of things.
In the underwater, you're talking about high water mark, right? So that way, if you go put in, for those unaware, if you go throw in $1 million into a hedge fund, they get it up to 10 million, and then they drop back down to 5, and then it goes back up to 10. You're not paying your fees to get it back up to $10 million again, right? They've hit that high water. You're only paying your fees on any new profit that they're able to generate. Or else you could just continue to bring it up and then back down and then bring it up and then back down and continue to ramp up fees.
You mean
throughout
create an annuity?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Annuity of fees. So, and then obviously the inefficient markets, I agree completely. Long only portfolio in domestic stocks doesn't make a lot of sense at all, right? You have to start looking for inefficiencies. There has to be some semblance of an inefficient market for this to make sense. What do you think, Derek? How are you evaluating this hedge fund?
I think the only thing I'd add to that is kind of going back to that private equity or private real estate we talked about was liquidity. I'd probably try to get an idea to see if they allow quarterly redemptions, something like that, that you can actually get to the money if you need to. One thing to keep in mind is even if they do offer quarterly redemptions, if what hits the fan, they can just turn those off and just say, we're not doing redemptions right now. So you could still be in there longer, but I'd still like to have an idea of how that looks.
Yeah, that's a dangerous one because that one gets thrown in as a sales pitch for a lot of these of it's illiquid, but we have quarterly redemptions. Tell us how much you want out and we'll let you get out. And then there's a clause in there that says if they don't want you to get out, they can just turn that off, and now you're stuck in there, right? So you're not able to get out of that with the redemption anymore. So, all right, there's a few more. Let's try to get one more. I won't get in too much trouble here on the timing. All right, my father passed away last year and left everything to my mother, which is fine, but now she has about 18 million and no plan. She's 74, lives down in Florida. What should she be thinking about at this point? How do I bring it up without seeming crass? And, I think those conversations never get easy, right? Unfortunately, I think maybe you have a good opportunity to bring that up because of your father's passing, and to discuss that and say this is what happened and everything moved over to you. I'm worried about what's going to happen next, and with 18 million and Florida, I don't think there's a big estate tax risk, at least right now, as long as she's spending what she should. Right? If she's not spending the money and it goes up, then we could potentially run into problems. But at 18 million and 74, if she's not spending, that could get up there quite a bit. But I think I would be bringing up the point that she should be spending as much as she wants of that money, and then starting to discuss passing some of that down. Where I think that conversation gets really messy is if she's not spending that 18 million, but in this we see this happen all the time where there's a bigger need for the money now, right, than there will be later. Right? So you run into this kind of odd situation. That's where the conversation gets a little tricky of, if you're not going to need the 18 million, then why don't you give the $10 million now? Because we could actually use the $10 million. And it's one of those things that I sometimes with parents were to consider that on the other end more, because when a lot of times when we bring that up, they don't see it that way. And a lot of the times it's because that this is the first generation of money. So they never felt that other side that their kids are in. We're like, well, mom and dad have this big pile of money over there, and I keep telling them to take vacations, and they refuse to take a vacation. So, and I'm, over here struggling trying to pay bills, and I could retire right now if I had a little bit of money hit my account. And it's that pool. So I can't say there's an easy way to have that conversation, but I will say the tried and true way to start that conversation is you blame us. Right? You say that my advisor talked to me, and I didn't want to have this conversation, but Stephan said, I need to have this conversation, and this is what he said we need to do. And that a lot of times will break the ice pretty easily on that. But how do you have that conversation?
I agree with that, and I think the most difficult thing is that it's likely she's not spending what she should be
Yep.
spending. I think that's the most likely result. There's really excellent large sample evidence, right? I'm always going to go back to the evidence, and the evidence suggests that most Americans are accumulators. People who accumulate are accumulators, and they're not very good at spending, right? And so there's really good evidence that most people come to end of plan. That's the language I like to use. Come to end of plan with more money than they started, right? And I don't think that's what you want, right? So I think you start that conversation just the way you said. I had a client and I said, you should pay capital gains. And I think they were a little surprised by that. And I'm like, you pay capital gains so you get to do stuff, right? You should never let a capital gains tax stop you from doing what you want to do, right? I always joke, and this, in finance, paying capital gains is a high quality problem. And so I like it when my clients have quite high quality problems. And so that's what that is.
Yeah, you're gonna have to balance this sort of not ruining your presentation for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Getting too far into the...
Yeah, Deon's giving insight to my presentation tomorrow. Is kind of messing it up a little bit, but
You can't mess up. No, yeah.
I would say, I think just having a conversation with your mom or your dad, whoever, just about what they want to do with the money. Talk more about, you don't have to get in like, hey, you should give me some of that money. You just talk about, hey, let's talk about, maybe you wanted to do that trip, stuff like that. Other things that they could be doing. You don't have to, it could be more about what she wants to do with it. Probably an easier conversation that way.
And outside of the money aspect, there's also very much a practical aspect of having those conversations. So that way, where, like, is there an estate plan in place? Are there trusts in place? Who are you supposed to call? Like, how are properties titled? There's a lot of very practical things that have nothing to do with, I want you to hand down some of the money early type of scenario, and have everything to do with, we just want to know, so that way we actually have a plan, or know there's a plan. You don't even have to say what the plan is. I just want to know there's a plan and who I'm supposed to call if something were to happen. So I think that's a big area there. All right. So I think we're at time there. So, well, thank you very much for joining and for adding some content. That's our show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
The information provided in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to constitute financial, investment, or other professional advice. The opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Before making any investment decisions, you should consult with a qualified financial advisor who can assess your individual financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Thanks for listening.